I didn't even get a chance to eat my chip. Hey, hello. If I sound different, I actually don't know if I sound different. Hello? Do I sound different? Hello? 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 Testing. 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 It sounds the same. If I sound different, it's because I had to uninstall my audio drivers because my audio drivers were causing timing issues. I have finally figured out why I keep blue screening. So I keep blue screening because my system doesn't play well with itself. It's weird. But also because I think I overclocked too much and my cooling system is failing. So I figured, okay, let's not overclock as much as I could on my CPU, and let's go for a smaller number because that's the safest option. So I have an i9 9900K, and that thing was going pretty well for a couple years, but I had to push it down to 4.9 gigahertz versus the 5.1. Today, and sorry about the bag of chips. I just need to eat one chip. Okay. Today, they're going to be a bit of a weird stream. One, there's no lizards. No lizards there, okay? No monsters, no hunties. The game has had pretty bad launch. I have expected it, given the state of Dragon's Dogma 2 especially. But seeing it like this, I was like, damn, that's pretty bad. The main problem being that the performance is awful. So without frame gen on 3060 or something, you're looking at maybe people going, roughly 40 to 50 FPS without any helpers of that sort. What's interesting is that frame gen, the way that it's used and the way that it seems to be touted, the way that it seems to be pushed as a solution to get more frames and more FPS, feels weird because the game feels worse if you do it when you're below 60 FPS. When you're below like a consistent timing for input, it feels awful. It's one of the worst things to have within any game when your input feels off. But in this case in particular, it feels really, really bad. Hello, chat. How are you? And then consider that a 3060 is not a cheap graphics card by any means. Like if I go to search for like a 3060 to buy, let's go, I don't know, Canada Computers, because I'm Canadian, it's a Canadian thing today, okay? Canada Computers 3060. And we look at the price. It is $419. Now, by comparison, AMD recently announced wait, is it the announcing? Yeah. They recently announced their 9070 and 9070 XT that start at $549. So, NVIDIA cards are overpriced. We know that. But when you're also buying sort of like the weakest of the current tier generation graphics cards, like a 3060, and it still costs you $500 and you still can't run Monster Hunter Wilds, there's something wrong. There's something wrong that something at that price point still can't beat a console in terms of its pure price to performance ratio. Because $500 for one component is still missing the rest of the computer. And the rest of the computer, I would argue, probably gets close to another 400 to 500 if you want comparable specs that doesn't bottleneck, right? So you're looking at basically the same price as a PS5 Pro that's going to effectively do the same performance, if not worse. And it makes you wonder, what's the point? It's because PC optimization is usually done as a final step. It's done as a very last thing that no one really cares about. And Capcom is notorious for this. Both Resident Evil, every Resident Evil game so far has been amazing. And I played these before stream, so don't blame me. But then you have things like Dragon's Dogma 2, which was a cult classic, and that game only recently got better performance. Maybe a couple of patches ago. Well, maybe a couple months ago at best. The problem is that it took so long that I think most people dropped the game entirely, which is unfortunate because it's kind of hard to keep it going, especially when it's that bad. And then you also have other games that have come to PC from other studios that have proven that they can do fairly well. Like Silent Hill, it runs kind of crazy in the sense of like it has some stutter and slowdown, but overall it was a fairly stable experience, except for the fact that when you're streaming, you can't do both at the same time, right? So we're seeing effectively the death of the PC optimization. Marvel Rivals, for instance, had a couple of issues at launch, but it's also a fairly simple game that doesn't really suffer from much. So we're seeing just a lot of issues across the board with these games, and it's kind of sad to see it happen for yet another major release. So I'm glad that the reviews reflect that. but it's also their most sold PC game, so maybe it doesn't really matter. But Resident Evil 4, for instance, when that first came out and I first played it, like that thing ran like butter. It was surprisingly smooth to play, even though I had to turn off everything and make sure everything worked. And to be fair, that was like off stream, but yeah, that was a very very solid experience. So it was nice. Obviously, because of that, I'm not gonna be playing it on stream. Also, because I want to play with my friends, so it's a bit of a double whammy of I can't really dedicate time to playing it. We're finishing games. We're not gonna start new ones. I swear to God. In other news, there was also something that happened recently with Firefox, which is interesting because to be fair, I had a fairly bad response to it in the sense of like, man, this thing seems awful, and I don't know why they're doing it. But at the same time, the more you think about it, it kind of makes sense why they do it. It's just sad because it's sort of the state of affairs of what they're of like what Mozilla is now that I think things have changed a lot. So they have a new terms of use for Firefox, and they've also updated their privacy notice. The privacy notice is really really good. The manifesto is sort of interesting because it, in many ways, outlines a lot of what we hope they do, but they don't really do it super perfectly. But I think you can't let good be the enemy of perfect. But it's weird because they're slipping away from the good part and they're slipping further and further down the steps of good. Oh, that thing. You were going to respond. Yeah, I kind of figured some of you would respond. But if you actually go over it, it is actually interestingly vague in many different ways. Let's see. But the interesting part is that it ties into directly their privacy notice, which this is much more well thought out and much more well written compared to their terms of use, which feels like a first draft. Like the way that their terms of use is written, they conflate the term services and they conflate the term Firefox, which is interesting. And they also don't really explain specifically what they do. You don't really see any problem with it. Firefox already effectively does everything in it. It describes in that edition. It uses browser history for all completion, uses passwords, you input the password manager, sending diagnostic data is on by default, and a plethora of other things. Yeah, well, that's the thing that's interesting. This clause edition just makes it clear in TOS. Most software TOS have similar clauses. Well, not really. So this is the problem. Is like most. This is the problem with the one that I have with the Firefox one. They're not really clear about what's a service and what Firefox is specifically in regards to the services thing. Everywhere else, they're very, very clear about Firefox not being a service. They're very clear about Firefox, the browser, being the tool that you use. But you don't have these. You don't have such overreaching data usage terms within the product side of things for other types of products. Like if you look at, and somebody posted a great example of this. If you look at sort of the example of like Microsoft Word for just the local edition, the one that you don't even need to connect to the online sort of Office 360 version of it, it doesn't have terms like it's going to use your data to help you do something. Like there's nothing of that sort. It's only when you use the online version of it that actually matters, right? The thing that you're right about is that there's features that you go through within Firefox that enable this. So again, the autocomplete, the sending it over to like your password manager and stuff. But the thing that's weird about me is that they have this like overreaching terms of use clause, and the way that it's written right here specifically is that it's very uncertain how far this would go, it feels very odd because it's at odds with what they usually do. Like the thing that you have to, I think, compare it with specifically is not the way that other software works, because Mozilla and Firefox have always positioned themselves as not other software. This is I think the key to people's arguments that I also kind of agree with, because Mozilla has always been sort of a in defiance of what other people do for the sake of their manifesto, which they actually, again, their manifesto is sort of their aspiring goal that they go towards, and it's actually very, very like solid. It has some weird issues with it, but for the most part, it's just like how heavy they are on it and how contradictory it is to the current world that they have this and they can still somehow make money, but that their main money source is also in a way contradicting this. Like apparently, like if you look at their like finances, a lot like quite a bit of their money comes from other browsers and like other companies saying like, hey, use our search engine first. Like you can't remove Google and the Bing because they pay for it. but those companies don't care about this stuff, right? So it's a bit of a catch-22 where to fund something like this, you need to have the bad to like funnel the money over to the good. But the key, I think, is to look at this and look at their privacy policy and recognize that both of these are written to the point where they're significantly clearer on what they want to do compared to the terms of use. This, again, this is their privacy policy is really good because if you go to certain data and then you look at exactly what they collect, they note everything, but piece by piece too, and they tell you when they take it. It's not a blanket term that says, "Oh, we will take everything for the sake of doing things." The only blanketness is specifically is within this section, which I think is interesting and bad. But at the same time, it's sort of a concession that they have to do because most people won't care about the specifics of what's being used. But they have an extra link that you can go to that tells you that. Here, with the terms of use, there's nothing of that sort. If you say you give Mozilla all rights to operate Firefox including processing data as we described in the Firefox privacy notice, which the way that they write this, right? All rights necessary to operate Firefox, including, which means both of these things are separate. So it's not just the Firefox privacy notice. It's the way that you use Firefox as well. So again, all those built-in features. But it also, what does that mean by the built-in features? As well as acting on your behalf to help you navigate the internet. When you upload input information through Firefox, you hereby grant us a non-exclusive, royalty-free, worldwide license to use that information to help you navigate, experience, and interact with online content as you indicate with your use of Firefox. So through Firefox means you use it as a tool, you push things, data through it. But at the same time, operating Firefox is a separate thing compared to the privacy notice within Firefox. So it's unclear what they mean by through Firefox and this and this. Like where does this necessarily lie? And do they mean to classify Firefox as the browser tool? And what is the baseline sort of like feature set of a baseline browser tool set, right? Like what do you do with it that keeps it just the Firefox browser and not a Firefox service, which is primarily what the Firefox privacy notice deals with, is primarily the services. And then going on forward to say, as you indicate with your use of Firefox, and then helping you to interact with that content, right? This one's a bit weird because depending on how you read it, it can be like the way that you use it defines the definition, which is funny because it's like the way that you use anything defines the definition, but also like not really, because you can use a hammer to screw in like a screw, but you should really use a screwdriver. Just because you can use a hammer doesn't mean you should. So it's like it's weird in that sense. But key to this, I think, is that this isn't very clear about beyond the Firefox privacy notice what this actually operates on. Because again, we can make the assumption that those features are correct, but why are we making assumptions? This is sort of the thing about legalese that you have to keep in mind, right? There's no need to make assumptions in a legal document like this. They should just write it out. Like, honestly, it's already to the point where it's incomprehensible for 99% of people. I want to say, like, this much is enough that most people will probably stop reading here. I'm not kidding you. And they will probably only read these headlines on the side, and that's it, right? It will always be to the point where legalese will get to the point where nobody can, like, read it well. And I'm surprised that they don't have any follow-up link that says, okay, well, what exactly does this mean in terms of using just the browser itself? The Firefox privacy notice kind of has this with a sense of like, it says to provide you with the Firefox browser, there's technical data, location, language preference, settings data, unique identifiers, and interaction data. But even this is very, very vague, right? The way that it is very, very vague. The only concession that we have is that they say specifically what they ping and like what they do with certain things and what happens when you use other services. So, for instance, if you provide an improved search functionality, then it uses more. But do you see this? They both list technical data. It's a very blanket term to say whatever data is a technical aspect of things. But then you can also argue that every data is technical. So what does that even matter? Location is a technical data because it requires a lot of technology to get there. So what is technical data, right? Like there's a lot of weird like vagaries around it. So I would argue that they're still sort of off, right? Like and again, the fact that they were off to the point that they had to put an update to say we've seen a little confusion about the language regarding licenses, which to be fair, which is not the same as copyright ownership passing on, but license to use, says to me that they kind of failed at this first draft, right? Again, you're giving it the benefit of the doubt, but I think you have to look at this from a pure like, if you were somebody running your company and you had to evaluate Firefox in use in a clear gap, I forget the actual term, in a system that has to be fully isolated, that you have to know everything that's going in and out of that system, this would probably fail it entirely. That's what I meant by like my statement of like, if you're working on something and you happen to go to it and it can't leak at all, what are the odds that Firefox gets in trouble for it? The way that it's written now seems like they'd get for sure in trouble for it. That's why it feels very overreaching. I'm surprised that they don't denote specifically every single feature that they have the way that they usually would over in the Firefox privacy notice. But it's why it's weird that they do this separately, because they tell you specifically you have to read the Firefox privacy notice, but they don't say that you have to. They just say please read. Really, what this should read is for this the thing that this should read is all information about what this encompasses in terms of use depends on the context in which you use it, and those contexts are made clear in the Firefox privacy notice, which you must read along with the terms of use. The problem is that they also sort of rely on the legalese. So this is the legal procedure thing of like, you automatically sign into the privacy notice, and so it's like you're automatically signed into having to read every single notice that your product gives you. Like if your product gives you a warning and you don't read it, it doesn't mean that you all of a sudden forego the legally binding nature of that warning, right? The only time it really is foregone is if it goes against laws. So it's like most ULAs, end user license agreements, are not enforceable because they actually go against things that you're not allowed to do within certain legal systems, right? But again, same thing with the privacy notice. You have to read it. It's there. You have to make sure that you adhere to everything. They just don't really like it's very minor. It feels like a minor note of like, hey, by the way, if you're reading this now and you've never read these before, you have to give this a look because this actually ties directly into this. They just go, please read it. It's like, no, you have to be much more specific about it. Yeah, the rest of it is fine. It's just, it was an interesting piece of that, as well as this piece. Your feedback and suggestions. If you give Mozilla any ideas or suggestions or feedback about the services, you give Mozilla permission to use them for free and without any additional obligations. This is the one that conflated services with Firefox, the browser. Because Firefox, the browser, and services, they seem to try to make it like two very different things of like, this is Firefox, the browser specifically, but the services we have is the things that you said, which is like, the browser history for auto-completion, which I don't really know how far that goes in terms of service because it's all local, but I digress. That's probably a larger discussion of like, if it works on your local system, does it really need all of this fluff? And how far does it really need to go with it? But it's more of a legal protection thing because of the overly litigious nature of Americans. Using passwords you put into your password manager. Hell, even when you search things inside the search bar and it does like a preemptive search, that's sort of like that whole idea of like what a service is. At least in the rest of their documents, like it's especially in the privacy notice, they make it very clear that the browser is not the same as the services that Mozilla provides. The problem is that when they say it like this and then they leave it up to ambiguity, and again, this is sort of the problem. The ambiguity sort of like bites them in the ass because it's like, what does that mean? Because does this apply to feedback about Firefox then? It doesn't seem like it because Firefox isn't a service. But maybe it is, in which case, does this even matter then? Like maybe everything that falls under services also falls under the Firefox browser. But then when you actually go to use the various services, like I'm not going to do it because it's going to show some like settings, but if you do it and say you use the Firefox sync stuff, it has its own privacy agreement and its own license and own terms of use, right? So that's why it gets confusing. And again, I think depending on your point of view, whether you give it leniency or not, I think it's best to always err not on the side of leniency because that's how it's going to work in court. Like the way it works in court is like if you don't follow the letter, people like you're going to get your ass rammed, right? Now, obviously, there's obviously there's sort of like this idea of like common sense and precedence, and this idea of like judge and jury can actually they have the ability to interpret it as they will it, right? But if the system by itself sort of doesn't really do that for all cases, and in general, you're probably going to have to follow the terms and conditions set out before you, I think it's best to read it just as it is and recognize that it's missing something. It's missing something very important, and that's some level of reining in of this whole piece and some level of understanding of what is exactly is Firefox and what exactly is the various constituent parts of Firefox, right? Because there is, again, that one argument that I do agree with is like a browser is just effectively curl, a renderer for various elements, of which, by the way, it doesn't even need to know the elements itself. Like, it doesn't need to know the content of the website. Most every browser probably can get away with only just the tags. I don't think there's anything that actually requires you to know the content in the sense that we know the word know, right? In the sense that humans would know things. It just needs to operate on it as if it's streams of data in order to format it and show it on screen, right? Because to a browser, this is just a stream of like text data that's coming through that's enclosed in between two p tags, right? So theoretically, that's all a browser is. But then, like, how far do you go with it? Is me typing into this search box a service? Is that a part of a core browser experience? Is me being able to go to my settings and change things a core part of the browser service? Or is that something that we have to do as like a third-party thing? Is me being able to zoom in and out, is that something that is a core browser feature? Or is that something that a browser does because it wants to? Because again, browsers never used to have the zoom feature. It was just added for accessibility, but accessibility is not like a required standard to a certain degree. It's only really required for government institutions and only in some places. So it's like, what do you define as a browser? Like that's the ambiguity that you get to. And I think this points to that larger piece of like, you know, be careful of the ambiguity because that's going to bite you in the ass. And again, I'm going to say it, like they wouldn't have had to put out this update if it was clear from that point of view. I don't think. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of cases that you're going to have to, right? We all sort of know that. And again, as you say, if you search for something and I go from like here and I type this and it goes straight to Google search, it's going to have to be able to act on my behalf, effectively passing this over. Because from Google's perspective, whether or not it's a browser typing this in or the user typing it in, it doesn't really matter. You're both sort of like the user of Google's terms of services. And so therefore, they have to act on your behalf. And so therefore, Firefox has to take on some legal ramifications for doing so. Like if I type in, right? If I type in how to find CEO of Health United, whatever the company is, right? Firefox would be on the hook for this because the sort of their tool is pushing this over to Google and making the request. But also, is that the case? Like, where does that sort of line blur? Where does that line end and then begin, right? We've never really had a good definition for this. To be fair to Firefox, we've never had a good definition of like when is it a tool and when is it something that the tool is doing for you. And software is a bit more complicated than normal tools because at least in normal tools, you know when it stops and when it ends, and you know when the responsibility stops and ends, right? Even for something like a gun, we never really charged the gun. I don't think we've ever really charged the gun. I think some places will be like, okay, some guns are more dangerous than others. Maybe they don't give you automatics, but they'll give you semis, right? But in most cases, they're going to look at the person who fired the gun and say, it's your fault. But I don't know how far that goes for software with sort of the lines blur because in many ways, it's automating a lot of what we do. Like when you search into Google through Firefox and Firefox passes that along, is it passing it along in a way that constitutes sort of the idea of like a pipe in the sense of a real world pipe of water, where the pipe isn't really responsible for the water that you get? Obviously ignoring the real world ramifications of things like, you know, lead coated pipes and this, like lead line pipes and stuff like that. Or is it doing something akin to typing it in Forest? Like what does the world consider that to be? That's sort of why it's interesting, right? So I get why they do it. I get why it's so vague. They have to. I hate that it's vague because it's not really the Mozilla way. The Mozilla way has always been about a lot of clarity and a lot of understanding of what's going on. And they actually like mention this in various places. Anytime they go through policy changes, they always mention that they strive to be as clear as possible, right? You know, there were some other things recently about them removing this idea of selling your data. Now they removed all references to selling your data, and now they sell your data. And it's like but the thing that they always make clear is that they want to be as transparent as they can, and their privacy notice, and even that change to selling your data, which to be fair was somewhat masked in terms of the process, was still very clear about what they're doing with your stuff, right? But you know, with this terms of use, it feels like an entirely different document written by somebody else that doesn't really know about how Mozilla works. And I think it's fair to say that they kind of dropped the ball on this one. It is also interesting too because I think a lot of people sort of like woke up to the idea that not every browser is going to be good, and it's just a reality, right? I think at some point you have to sort of concede to reality that making a browser is very, very complex to the point where you need whole teams in place just to be able to secure a browser, let alone make a browser that works across a very large moving target. So the finding CEO thing, you talk about that they don't allow you crimes with their services and their services TOS. Well, yes, but I'm talking about it in a more generic case. I'd like think about it in the sense of like when does something stop being a tool and when does something end up being the propagator, right? Imagine if you assault someone and you punch them in the face and you don't have a gun with you, right? All they go home with is a bruise and you go home with like a minor assault charge, right? Well, it's not really a minor assault charge. It's still a lot, but still compared to murder, it's a minor assault charge, right? And then you have a knife and you stab them, okay? 50-50 that they die or they live. Well, now it's escalated. But it escalated because you had a knife. Does it mean that it's a knife fault? It's the knife's fault, or is it you? Still, you'll be charged appropriately. If they die, it's murder. If they just get hurt, then it's assault with a deadly weapon. But then you have a gun, and you shoot them, and you shoot them in the head, and they for sure die. When does it stop being your fault? Well, it's always going to be your fault, but when is it also the tool's fault, right? This is a thing that the world is still debating at large. So, and we can't get this right for things that sort of, in the sense of like, are inherently violent. Like we're still trying to figure out what is sort of like the middle ground that serves the world best and that makes the most sense. And you know, that's for guns, let alone a browser or like a hammer. You know what I mean? Like it's very hard to determine this stuff. So I want you to look at it as that larger lens and not just specifically finding a CEO, because it's how do I say this? Law is all about like what can and can't be done within the context of whatever legal thing it is. In the sense of like, what do these terms allow and what don't these terms allow? It's why loopholes exist. It is why loopholes are tolerated, because if the terms weren't as clear as they could be to deny the loophole, it's the term's fault. So look at it like that, in the sense of like, when you use Firefox to look that up and it's a part of an entire pipeline of how they do things, what does that mean? You're pretty sure services are something like the VPN. So they say if you do those things, they can stop providing the service to you. This edition about using user input specifically for Firefox, and those services for VPNs don't pertain to Firefox. Well, then you just missed exactly what I said then. Like, that's what I mean by, like, it's unclear. So the way that they write this document, they do say that specifically for Firefox is a free and open web browser software. Firefox terms in use, right? But then what is this line? If you give Mozilla any ideas, suggestions, or feedback about the services, right? The services being what? Is it those things? But then why is it under terms of use for Firefox? Is it conflating that Firefox is now a service? Or is it conflating that, you know, services and this are two different things, and this is a terms of use for both things? So what exactly is Firefox then? Is this the Firefox, the brand terms of use? Is this the Firefox, the umbrella terms of use? Is this the Firefox, the family of software terms of use? Or is this Firefox, the browser terms of use? Which it seems to be the terms of use for the Firefox browser software. And then it has all this spiel about what is a service. Now, I think that down here, this makes more sense in terms of the services. Like, if you use these certain optional services, this makes sense, right? But specifically the way that they put this here, and then it seems like they're conflating the idea of, like, suggestions for services and the browser at the same time. Like, realistically, this should probably be moved down here for clarity if that's what they want to do. But also, your use of Firefox must follow Mozilla's acceptable use policy. So, you know, even what you say doesn't really make sense, because it's, again, if it's just the services, how come this is specifically said your use of Firefox, was then previously defined as Firefox is the free browser, and these terms of use, it pertains particularly to your copy of the Firefox software that comes from, and in their privacy notes, they say from an authorized source, aka their websites or any repository that they own that they specifically maintain. The browser that they compile from their source, which is a completely different source. Now, all of a sudden, the acceptable use policy applies to that and not just the services. You know what I mean? Like, then things get a bit complicated. Like that's what I mean by like I don't think anyone's actually read this. I think everyone's just sort of seen the headline and then gone, oh yeah, like this is this is how it is. But when you read it, the thing isn't very clear. Like it sort of jumps around back and forth. It's why it's odd. Um, and again, it's difficult because like what's illegal in one place is legal in another place, and so it's like, what do you do? You know what I mean? Like it's like there's some things that are always going to be illegal just because they also fall under some like general moral hazard, but other things is like what exactly denotes the line of illegality, right? Especially in the context of like things like that. I think there's a lot of vagaries of like if you're searching the name of somebody, is that fine? And then but if you end up using it and they think that you use it, is that illegal or is that not? Like it's you know what I mean? That's what I mean by I like think of it generally. Like really expand your your understanding of it because then when you test the limits of these terms, you realize it feels a little off. There was also one other line down here that I think was also weirdly contradicting. Firefox isn't a service, but them making Firefox is a service. It's also a very common clause that protects them from copyright claims from people who propose things. Yeah, but them making Firefox and them doing that as like their service, why do they describe it within the terms of use then? Because this is the thing. Your use of Firefox must follow Mozilla's acceptable use policy, and that you agree you will not use Firefox to infringe on anyone's rights or violate any applicable laws or regulations, right? And I'm not saying that I don't necessarily disagree that they have to make a common clause, but in the sense of the rest, what I'm trying to say is that in the sense of the rest of the document, it's very unclear as to what exactly the goal of this is and why it feels so overreaching compared to the rest of their documents that they, and although really it feels like a lot of legal documents, it feels like it's overreaching compared to a lot of legal documents. It's the kind of overreach that you see in employment contracts where they say you can't work at any other place that does anything remotely similar to what you do here. It's like, okay, well, what is remotely similar? Is it anything that involves programming? Then they can't work anymore, right? Like that's what I mean by it feels overreaching. It's vague and it expands the scope to the point of infinity, to within its sort of like orientation. And them making Firefox is not the same as your use of Firefox, right? Again, your use of Firefox must follow Mozilla's acceptable use policy. If it was them making it and they would want to sort of prevent indemnification, or is it indemnifying them? They already have this. You won't claim Mozilla is responsible for your use of Firefox in indemnification. This does exactly what you say. So why do they need the rest of this? Like this is, again, when you actually read the thing in full, you realize this is a bit weird. Like, if they have this, why do they need the rest of it? This already claims that, you know, the tool is a tool and like a tool is a tool. And then all of a sudden they say this stuff too, where it's like your use of Firefox, it feels weird. It feels like it jumps around in terms of its various wants and desires. But at the same time, this is like most legal documents. So again, any employment contract that says like you can't work in a similar industry, it's already subject to a very easy win in court for you because they can't do that, right? Like this is just a thing that happens with every single legal document. Is they're never really clear. But coming from Firefox, it's like, damn. I was really hoping that we'd get something similar to the Firefox privacy policy. But that's what I mean by like every argument that I've heard for and against it. Well, for it has sort of like missed pieces of it that makes me go, I don't know if anybody's ever actually read this. But some people have, and they seem to be making the same points as me. But I also don't really know, right? But at least the way that I read it, it's like this already does that. So this is weird because like this so it seems to conflate the idea of Firefox being a part of their services. And this also applies additional terms on top of Firefox, which were already there but were unspoken. But then it's like it's that weird conflation and that expanding and that contracting of like what a service is, what Firefox is, that makes the whole thing confusing. Again, it feels like it's both Firefox as the brand and services as whatever Mozilla does, with the Firefox umbrella, which includes everything: the browser, the VPN, the tab syncing, the whatever other services they have. I think they have. I know they have like a weird service now. I can't remember what it was, but there was a new service that I thought was pretty cool, but I also thought it was very niche. I can't remember the name of it, but they announced it like last month. Yeah, it's pretty interesting sort of terms of use. Again, if you go through other ones, it's very similar, but also very different in the way that like they don't really go this far to say this many things in this vague of a way. Typically, they get very, very, very specific about what you can do, and they even split it up by your local version, so you using it as a tool versus you using the online portions as like a service. This one just seems to conflate the two, but at the same time, the way that it's ordered, if you read it within order, the only thing that's really out of place is probably just this one. And this one just sort of expands it to be whatever the Firefox privacy notices, and then hopefully this doesn't expand further. It just feels very, very loose, if that makes sense. But yeah, it doesn't feel like anyone's ever read this. Again, the scenario that I pointed out still holds true. Like, it's weird that the scenario that I pointed out still holds true. Of like, if I'm working on something that requires some level of security clearance and thus secrecy, and I use Firefox to work with it, and I use their official version, which to be fair would be stupid. It is contrived in the sense of like you would never do that because A, it'd be air gapped. B, you'd probably be using some custom build that would get rid of everything. And I don't even know if they would even have browsers within such systems. Maybe they might, just because it's an easy target to go for. But probably they're just going to build everything to spec native, just so they know exactly what's going on. But I digress because I've never worked there. Only my friend has, and he's not allowed to tell me anything, which sucks. Then it's like all of a sudden Firefox is liable for it, or like they're gonna use it because now it's theirs, and then I give them a license to use it, right? The only thing that is interesting, that I think people always get wrong actually with this, the license part, people really do think that's like a copyright change. The copyright still stays with whoever had the thing. If I upload a copyright image and I give you a license, that's illegal. But it's not illegal for Firefox to do. It's illegal for me, right? But if I own the thing and I'm a part of the thing, and then I give Mozilla a license to it, and then they use it, and then they take a license from it, based on their wording of like, you give Mozilla all rights not necessary, and you grant them a non-exclusive royalty-free worldwide license to use that information, and they use that information for various things, is that a Firefox problem or is that a user problem? But again, it goes back to the whole idea of like, is it the gun's fault or is it your fault? It's sort of that sort of blurry line of what line do you draw in the sand for either of these two things? It's why I mean it's just vague. It's just a very vague wording of things. And obviously, this is going to be a problem for all of time because it's going to take forever for anybody to get down to what this means. Because I'd be surprised if we have a... Actually, maybe we do have a legal definition of browser. I vaguely remember, I think Google was going to the courts for this one, for the monopoly. I'm pretty sure this was a part of the monopoly suit against Google. Was like, what is a browser? What is Chrome? What is the Chrome services? And then how far does it go? Because I think now they have like 97% market share, which I think also drove them not... In some places, at least I saw, but I didn't really catch up with it. They're not allowed to pay Firefox anymore to be the default browser. And so they're losing more and more money from this like anti-monopolization deal, which is interesting. It's an interesting catch-22 of anti-monopolization in a world that inherently sort of allows for the large monopolies to occur, if that makes sense. But yeah, the more I read this, yeah, it's just that bit that's very unclear to me. Because again, chat, like it's strange the way that it just feels vague, specifically within that axis of like Firefox service and your use of Firefox versus your use of services. But at the same time, the privacy policy does lay out very clearly what goes into you using your browser. And so it's like, it's not the worst thing ever. Again, other software does have this. It's just weird because for Mozilla specifically, again, they're very clear about how they do things. Like they define the data. They define everything that you use, right? They define how everything is used, and they do it in a way of like least complex to most complex. So if you want more information, you read more of it. But everything that you need in terms of the legal spiel is like up here. And only when you need to challenge or sort of understand specifically what they do with it, you have to go down here. And even then you can go on and see, okay, what is like technical data? And then you go over to this and it's like, okay, well, you see exactly what they get. They even have like a coverage ping, which I don't even know what this is. This ping is not enabled by default. When enabled, the ping is generated a total of once per profile as a diagnostic tool to determine whether telemetry is working for users. What? Why do they need this? Wouldn't it just be like wouldn't they just send the telemetry ping, and then if it fails, they wouldn't... Anyways, there's like a bunch of these things that they have, and they tell you about it. It's just weird that this, compared to everything else, feels very weak. Or, sorry. this compared to everything else that they have feels weak. Because this is strong, this is good, this is good. Like a lot of these are very, very clear. Even the acceptable use policy is like very, very clear of like what you can and cannot do with this and like what does this mean. But then it's like you may not use any Mozilla service in a way that violates this acceptable use policy or any of the binding terms. But then it's like, is Firefox a part of those services, or is it a tool? In the same way of like, do you blame the hammer when somebody smashes someone's heads in? Or and then do you say that it's the hammer facilitated that, or do you say that the person would have done that no matter what? That's where it gets unclear, right? But I don't think that's something that they can solve by themselves, other than making it very, very clear at the very top. This must be read in tandem with the privacy policy, and then it gets kind of more clear, and making sure that they don't use Firefox as the brand name, because I know that Mozilla keeps doing this thing where they keep pushing Firefox as the brand, like the umbrella brand for things like their sync, their VPN, and the stuff. And just saying specifically the browser. Like, I wish they just didn't say Firefox. And I wish that they just said the browser and the services. And then they would make it very clear of like what's a browser and a service. When they say Firefox and then they use it interchangeably with this idea of services, and then the way that they position things on the document to be like services here, Firefox over here, browser up there at the very top, and then at the bottom it's like this thing applies to like everything. Your use of Firefox applies to like this. It gets very complicated to read even as like a layperson, right? Because you have to consider that this is from the perspective of like a layperson who's only dealt with contracts and like legal stuff on a need to know basis, right? Like, this is I am not a lawyer. And if I'm already getting confused on these points, I imagine the normal person will get confused. And it's a very different state of affairs from what they normally have. Like, their privacy policy is very clear. You can read this through and you understand pretty much everything that it does. You can do the same with their acceptable use policy. You can do everything with their manifesto too. These are very well written documents, right? There is obviously this idea of like, it's new, so they probably haven't had time to like test it. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know if that holds up in court. Like, how I always thought, to me, at least, that terms and conditions from lawyers would be very, very clear from the onset, because what's the point of a lawyer if it's not? Like, that's the thing that's funny to me. Is like, if it isn't clear from the very onset, and it doesn't work, what's the point of the lawyer even being here in the first place, doing all of this? And what's the point of even having them when, you know, that's their whole point, is to communicate clearly the legal terms under which Firefox needs to operate under, right? And in a way that everybody can read it and it makes sense, and that, you know, maybe you might need a lawyer to go through it again, but at least that lawyer will understand too. But it's not the first time that I've heard lawyers go, this is terrible and I don't know what this means, I'm gonna have to call them and talk about it. It's not the first time that I've heard that. So it's like, it feels like one of these things where it's like, what's the point of a lawyer drafting this up and putting it out there if it's not clear and not good? It doesn't make any sense. But that's another rant about why I hate lawyers. Because I feel like most lawyers aren't... It's fascinating to see that this idea of... I take back the most thing, but it is fascinating to see that this idea of like, there's somebody who's good at their job and there's somebody who's bad at their job also applies to the very, very top echelons of what people consider jobs. Like, as an engineer, there's like good engineers and bad engineers. As a lawyer, the lawyers I've spoken to, they've said there's good lawyers and there's bad lawyers, and not in terms of a moral thing. Like, they say, like, I have to call them up to understand what the fuck they wrote, because it doesn't make any sense. And you see this a lot. So, I mean, I'm surprised, and then I remember that in the end, all those people used to be 5 years old, running around in like a playground, eating their own shit, right? So yeah, it makes sense why it's bad. Anyways, that was a fun little romp down that little side. Again, it just feels weird and very vague in many different ways. It's odd. I'm sure they're probably gonna fix it soon. There's no way that they leave it like that, especially because they posted the updates and they had to be clear that it applies to the privacy notice. They're probably gonna update the terms to say, okay, this is in tandem with the privacy notice. You must read the privacy notice to get the full effect of this. This is just a primer in terms of what your terms of use are, but then it sort of makes you wonder, what's the point of the terms of use if it's just a primer for the privacy notice? And if it's not the same as the privacy notice, then privacy notice has terms of use. Like, again, the way that they do that, it's just weird too, because it implies that the terms of use, you need the privacy notice, and that the terms of use is incomplete without the privacy notice. When that, in many ways, it's just a primer for what the privacy notice would already detail, because that thing's very detailed of what it uses from you to do whatever. But then it's like, what's the point of the terms of use? Except for just the clause of the indemnification, like just making it so that you cannot hold Firefox legally responsible for whatever you do with it. Like, it seems like that should be their only term in that entire document, and just to say whatever you decide to do with it, that's between you, God, and whatever legal system that you have, right? So I don't know. It just feels weird. In lighter news, and also something that I didn't really expect, actually. Let's see if I can actually find the repository. Here we go. About 23 hours ago, which was a bit weird, because you usually never see this. EA actually open sourced their Command and Conquer stuff. So I think everything, when I saw the release, it was like everything, but let's just actually check it out ourselves. But it's a lot. So so this is not the full game. You do need the assets, and to get the assets, you have to actually have the game purchased and stuff. What's interesting is that people have said that the games were released as freeware at some point, but anytime someone says freeware or abandonware, I think to myself, where is the legal definition of those things, and where does it come into play? Because you could have argued that Sims 2 was abandonware until they re-released it, but then it's like they still owned it. You couldn't just download the thing, but at the same time, maybe you could, because those things were just left up on GitHub, but then they were taken down as soon as it came back. So it's like, what exactly does that mean? Because does it apply to the entire copyright franchise? Does it apply to just the product itself? Like, again, more weird legal things around abandonware and freeware. I also don't trust the freeware and abandonware sort of denotions, but I make a liberal use of them. Because by God, am I not going to pass up the chance to have a game for free? Assuming you have the game from other sources, you can now compile, actually. You can now compile and use it as you want. So it's interesting to see, because they also added mod support, which is weird, because the mod support came beforehand, and I heard about that as well, but I couldn't recall what exactly they added. But the fact that they gave the sources sort of makes me go, what's the point of the mod support when you can just now make the game whatever you want? Like, in a way, mod support always tries to get towards as close as they can to the real source of things. And so it's like, now that they got to the point, it's like, do they really need mod support? I don't really know. It's also fascinating because they also include the remastered collection, which I didn't think would happen. So the remastered collection, compared to the rest of the stuff, is way more recent. Obviously. I mean, some of these things are from, like, way back in the day. The remastered collection, I didn't expect this one to get open sourced. I thought this one would be for sure something that would still try to push to, like, sell. But given that it's source only, it makes sense why they do so, because you still need to buy the game to, like, do it. So at least they have an incentive to at least help the community get this stuff going. And it's actually pretty cool to go through. I don't understand much of it because there's a lot of stuff in here, but it's fascinating to sort of see a company like EA do this. I imagine whoever tried to push for this probably went through hell and back. It seems very painful to them to, like, do stuff like this. Doesn't really matter if they define Firefox as a tool or a service. The only thing that the use policy does is says that they reserve the right to stop providing the services. They can't really stop providing you Firefox anyway, since it's on your computer and it's under open license. The only thing they can do is maybe not let you download from the site, which it wouldn't do anyway, since all that is just lawyers speak of freeing themselves from liability of what you do with that stuff. Well, then you're wrong. What? They can stop providing you with Firefox. That's the whole point of their terms of use. They say specifically from authorized sources in, like, various other legal documents. They say specifically if you download Firefox from an authorized source of theirs that you have to go through these terms, right? You can be withheld from using that stuff. You see it within open source projects too, where it's like if you use it wrong, they reserve the right to pull your license to use the open source thing that is otherwise free to use. So that doesn't make any sense. And it does matter if they define Firefox as a tool or a service, because they have two different terms for it. Like, whether it's under the services umbrella determines whether or not, for instance, the suggestions that you give for it belong to them. If it's not under the services umbrella, like if Firefox isn't under the services umbrella, and they don't have a similar term for suggestions, they've opened themselves up to a loophole. Where if I give them a suggestion for Firefox and I say, well, wait, it was a suggestion for Firefox specifically, not for your not for your services, and they implement it and they make money from it, you can get like money from it. Like it doesn't make sense. They can't. The license prohibits it. They can't come to your house and force you to delete it. No. I'm not talking about them forcing you to delete it. I'm talking about specifically your point about providing you Firefox. Like, that's wrong. They can stop you. They can stop providing you it officially, and then anything that you do to get it after the fact is illegal. Like, they can't take it off the site and like ban you specifically, obviously, because there's technical challenges to it. But if they say that you can't download it, you can't download it. And if you download it, it's on you. Like, they can prohibit that as like an act of like you doing something, and it would be illegal for you to own it. What else is there? The only thing that they can maybe do is not let you download it from the site, which they wouldn't do that anyway, since all that is just LoRa speak. It's not just LoRa speak. You can't download it from the site. You can download it from anywhere else. Right, yeah, exactly. So if you download it from unauthorized sources, then yeah. But then, that's sort of more of a larger case of like them defining the authorized sources, right? But like they themselves can stop you from downloading it. Like, again, now you're conflating it even further. So this is the problem with your argument, is you're conflating it to the generalization of software as a whole. Whereas I'm trying to speak with it from within the realm of like what does Mozilla themselves provide and like give you in terms of their service and in terms of what they provide in terms of their Firefox browser. They say specific, like within your authorized sources, within your official sources, they can absolutely say you can't download it from us legally, and if you do, then you're liable for it, right? But they can't realistically stop you from downloading it anywhere. And you're right that they can't force you to delete it because that's impossible. I'm saying specifically they can stop providing you Firefox. Like, specifically Firefox, like Mozilla themselves, can stop like legally providing you with Firefox. They just can't really enforce that because, again, it is a technical problem. But the technical problem is different from the legal problem. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Doesn't mean you... Just because you're technically able to do something doesn't mean you can do it from the perspective of law, right? Like, I can't have a pistol unlicensed in Canada, but I can 3D print a pistol very easily by downloading the file from anywhere. That doesn't mean that I'm all of a sudden off the hook for the legality of it, right? Like, I'm still legally, like, under the terms of, like, I can't have a pistol legally, even with a gun license, because there's very strict terms with, like having a pistol within Canada. But not a semi-automatic somewhat rifle, which is interesting. But I do agree it is lawyer speak. Like, a lot of it is lawyer speak, but at least the lawyer speak does have power. Like, it has power within their own domain. But you're right that they can just download it anywhere. But that's like a whole separate concern of like they can't stop people from being malicious actors. And like, you can't really stop someone from being a malicious actor. All you really can do is free yourself of the responsibility and say, we don't provide you it anymore. And if you use it, it's now all on you. That's what they're saying. But again, specifically, they can stop providing you Firefox. Like, they actually can. But don't look at it in terms of your use of the tool and like the fact that you still have the tool. Don't look at it in terms of like them pulling back the tool, because that's basically impossible in terms of pure logistics. It's specifically the fact that they themselves can say, we say that this person can't download from us anymore and that they're responsible for everything that they do in their own life. Like, that's where their line ends legally. And that's where most people's lines ends legally, in terms of like, once it's out of your hands, there's nothing you can do. But while it's there, you can refuse to give it to them as best as you can. And for something like this, the best that you can is probably just going to be, hopefully they follow the terms and conditions. It's like a restraining order. You can't stop somebody from showing up to the same place. You have to hope that there's a police officer or like something to help you enforce the restraining order. But they can still show up to your door. Like, there's nothing stopping them from showing up to your door. Yeah, obviously. But the reason why we have restraining orders is because it's legally binding. It's not because it's like practically binding. The law is not practically binding. In practicality's sake, you can still get a gun. You can still go up to someone's house. You can still download things. The point of it is, where does their legal responsibility end and begin? Sorry, I'm just... I just feel like I feel like I'm going crazy here. But you are right. It's sort of the reality of it that you can't take back anything once it's out there. It's why it's very hard to enforce these terms, Like, legally, they're protected in the court because now it's like, okay, this person wasn't able to use it, but they used it to plan some like murder. We're not responsible. They wouldn't be responsible anyways. But let's assume that their acceptable use policy wasn't clear on the fact that they had used it for murder. Like, let's say it didn't have a line of like, you can't use this for murder for some reason. I don't know why they would have that. And then somebody does use it, they'd still be clear because it's like, well, our license, we stop providing it to them. The fact that they have it is a technical thing that we can't stop. Like, unless you expect every company to have their own Pinkertons that go to somebody's house to take things back, which you really don't want because you don't want Wizards of the Coast style Pinkertons. There's nothing you can really do about that. But the court of law is not then going to say, well, because you didn't have Pinkertons, then you failed to uphold your end of the deal. No, the court of law is going to be like, well, you don't have Pinkertons, but we don't need you to have Pinkertons. The law is the law, and like whatever you define as like your legal basis for your contract of like use, that's what we're gonna uphold. Like, but it would be funny. It would be funny if it's like Firefox did have a Pinkerton style. Not being a malicious actor if you download from anywhere else. That's just how open licenses like GPL work. It's similar to how it works with Red Hat after it was acquired by IBM. They can stop providing you service that links this if you leak them, but that's the only thing that they can do. If someone else leaks the commercial distros to you, you're not liable for anything, and neither is the leaker, except the fact that they can be denied the service. Well, so that's also not really true, no? Because the person who leaks something, like, this is the problem. When you're using these terms, I want you to think about these terms in terms of like what they're usually used at. When you say that they leak something, does that mean that it's something that shouldn't have been available in the first place? You're correct that if you download it from anywhere else, you're not technically at fault because the license of the source code is open. So if you download LibreFox, for instance, you're not dealing with the Firefox side of things. But that's not what I'm saying. Like, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm saying. If you download Firefox as it's built by Mozilla, as it's provided by Mozilla, but it's hosted at a non-authorized Mozilla source, like, that's the thing that you can be liable. That's the thing that you can be liable for because it's, again, you're still technically copying something that is not really yours, that comes from a Mozilla provided source. We deal with this now with copyright stuff. Like, we deal with this in the sense of like, if you download a game, even though you're not the one who put it online, your ISP is still going to be like, hey, you pirated the game, you can't do that. And like, maybe that's where it differs in terms of like the terminology. Because when you say leaking things and when you say downloading it from somewhere else, I'm thinking in my head, somebody has provided a copy of Firefox's copy, of Mozilla's copy of Firefox. You're correct in that if you compile it from source, like LibreWolf or Fox or something, that it's free for you to like use, right? And that's just how the license works, and obviously they can't stop that, right? But that's a separate deal from using the authorized version of Firefox that is all of a sudden put somewhere else. And that's the problem with you using terms like leak, because it's like, is there Linux distros, and again, is that a service that they provide, or is that a tool that they provide you? Like, is that an operating system that they provide you as a service, or is that a product that they provide you? Because there's a difference of like, one is a continuous service, one is like a product. Like, where does it stop and end? What is the term of that? If you leak them, what does it mean by leaking them? Like, does it mean that you re-upload them somewhere else? Then yeah, of course you'd be liable for downloading it too. Like, it's the entire thing is like not good. You know what I mean? The entire thing is something that you shouldn't have. If it's something that shouldn't even be available to you in the first place. And you're wrong that the leaker would not be liable. The leaker is always liable for it. In fact, there's been many cases where leakers are always liable for it. There's been many times that leakers like get hit with like court cases that go all the way through, at least in the West, and they're the ones who get like a massive suit and they get, sued for millions of like dollars. Like, of course they're liable for it. Because if you leak something that shouldn't be publicly available, then you're stealing. Like, you're just stealing it from them. Like, that's why what you're saying feels very suspect of like, I don't really know if we're using the same terms and if we're in the same basis of like, if we're in the same context. Again, this is the problem, right? And specifically, I want you to look at what you're doing, and I want you to look at what the terms are written as, and I want you to look at how difficult legal discourse is. Because when you're unclear like that, when you're vague like that, you open it up to like a million different angles and interpretations. What's the interpretation that you want people to have, and how can you rewrite that to be as clear as you possibly can? The problem there is exactly the problem with the terms of use update. If you were going through that and you wanted to rewrite it to be as clear as you can, because as any legal document you probably should be. How would you do it in a way that would prevent these kinds of discussions and interpretations of it from rising? Because once you have these interpretations, all bets are off. You can define anything as anything, man. Like, that's what I mean by, like, I don't really like the terms of use in the sense of, like, it's very vague in these different ways. Because, again, now we're defining it piecemeal by piecemeal, but at the same time, it's like we both have different definitions of it. Which one is going to be sided with? Because there's precedence for both. You're pretty sure Firefox's binaries are distributed under the same license as the source code. It's not. For GOP license, it's for sure. With non-copyleft licenses, binaries can be licensed under the same license or a separate proprietary license. So I can't remember where it is now, but somewhere on their GitHub, they have a GitHub that has all their like legal terms. They have like a legal GitHub term repository thing. In there, it says specifically Firefox, as it is from their authorized sources, is under their terms. That's why it's like that's why this is complicated. Like, I don't think anybody knows all of their terms, and I can't even show you the source because I'd have to go through the entire repository. They say specifically Firefox under their authorized sources, aka from their sites and from anywhere that they officially package it and then distribute it as well, is under their Mozilla terms, right? Presumably their binary is under that term, right? But again, it depends on how you interpret it. Like, I interpret it as the binary that they build from their source and signed by them is under their Mozilla terms. But if you take the source code and you do it yourself, it doesn't matter because they can't force you to repackage it because their license is open. But they repackage their specifically built version of their source code. Like, they package their binary built from their source code under their own terms because they can't. But they don't force you to because they can't force you to. And because their license doesn't allow that. But that's sort of why it's open source in the first place. And why they did that is because they let people do whatever they want with it. It's why projects like LibreWolf and whatever that other browser that we saw last time from Mint like exists, right? Like, that's a problem. But again, this still points to the same problem of like, it's very vague, it's very wide reaching. These terms are everywhere. And the way that it's written, with no way to actually look these up, and no way to see these terms within that document, makes it very difficult to actually parse. That's sort of, again, the terms of use is not the worst thing in the world, but it's vague enough to be like, you get into these mind worms of like, what does this all mean? What exactly is the license of the Firefox binary as it comes from them? Did they repackage it under a different license because they sign it themselves with, whatever mechanisms that they have to release it on Windows and like stuff like that? Or, is it under the same license as the Firefox source code? In which case, can you use everything in it? Like, how much, like, what parts of it are actually licensed under Mozilla? Because again, if it's under the same source code as the license, your interaction with their services, insofar as it goes over to their side of their services, so insofar as you send data to their services, like servers and stuff, then it would matter. But then your other things of like, well, if you bookmark a link or something, or you use like whatever things that's like local to your machine, that wouldn't matter. And so it's like, what? Then it opens up this can of worms of like, what does the terms of use apply to? Does it apply to like every bit of local use of Firefox, or does it apply only to the things that like touch their like server? Like, that's what I mean by like, it's not very clear. And then again, combine this with the conflating of like Firefox and services. In that one section of the document, that also at the same time they're holding them legally liable is already covered by the piece at the very bottom. It's like, what do you do? Like, as a user, how are you supposed to read this? And it's like, the problem is that like, in the end, the only interpretation that matters is the one that goes to court, right? But if you operate under the assumption that your interpretation is correct, and the court rules otherwise, that's a bit of a weird legal situation that you found yourself in, because it's so vague that you could have argued for your case, but the court has argued otherwise, and now there's precedence, and so now it's like, well, are you in trouble? But that's how it reads like. Like, that's the way that I want you to look at this, and like go like, I don't know why they left it so open. When again, if you look at the privacy policy and the accessible use policy, those are very clear. Like, it seems very clear of like what I can and can't do. And for me, briefly skimming their whatever legal repository thing of like, it's under their authorized sources, it seems clear that they signed the binary, and like, it seems clear that they have the binary itself under a different license, but it's also unclear because it's specifically the authorized sources bit and also whether or not that actually can be done from that side. I'm pretty sure it can be, in the sense of like you can probably have something that's like open source but closed operation. I forget the actual term for it, but it's like it's open source, but you can't use their flavor of it willy nilly. It's like GitLab. Like sure, it's open source, but you also can't just take what they have and repackage it. Like in the sense of like you can't take specifically their binary version of it and repackage it as your own. You have to build it yourself and do it yourself. But yeah, it's just legal stuff. But that's why it's like confusing the entire thing. It's why I don't know why they wrote it the way that they did. And again, I'm just worried because it's a change specifically in the way that Mozilla operates. Usually Mozilla is pretty clear about what they do, but they've been doing some weird choices. I've been using some weird features that make me go, I don't know why this is happening within Firefox. But at the same time, it's just the reality that they need money. I think the reality of it is that Firefox needs money, and they need money to continue doing what they do. Like, non-profits doesn't mean no money, because you can't get people to do things for like free. So they have to do these things, but in doing these things, it's weird that they all of a sudden don't have the same level of care that they used to have, in the sense of like the clarity and like the precision that they used to be known for. And then on top of that, it's weird that they do things that sort of like feel different from their original mission, but at the same time, I think it's just the world. It's the use of Firefox mourning that the only alternative to Chrome that was actually decent and didn't like do crazy things cannot survive in this world without taking money from those things that do these crazy things. Again, if a lot of your income comes from having things like paid or is it default search engine deals, and that can't happen anymore because of anti-monopoly things, and therefore you can't profit off of that, and they have to build a profit themselves in a world that has increasingly become about profit over people. There's not really much that they can do as an organization focused on people to keep the lights on, especially in a space where browsers get very, very complex, right? And I criticized them on some things before, like the idea of like they didn't want to use SQLite's interface for doing things, and they want something that was truly cross-browser. But at the same time, it makes sense because it's like you can't just keep going along with status quo, because that's just more and more work that you have to do, and it's more and more unclarity around things that you have to meet the standard of. That eventually means that you will be overwhelmed by the amount of work. You don't have enough funds to like do it, and so things get behind, right? Now, there's no excuse for Safari, which Safari still doesn't have certain features that Google has with the Chrome, and Safari, presumably with Apple, makes enough money that they could probably implement those. But for Firefox, it makes more sense as to why they're usually behind on features that they themselves propose first. But again, it's just a shift in things as a whole. Like, we're seeing a shift towards them having to protect themselves legally, maybe doing so at least in my view, not necessarily the most clear way. It's very vague in many different ways. But they have to, in a world that is increasingly hostile to people first and people focused enterprises and corporations and movements, if that makes sense. So, what can we do, right? The truth is, we're probably going to have to rely on shoddy open source browsers that are probably going to have exploits in them out the wazoo, because it takes a lot of effort to get rid of those exploits. And there's nothing that we can really do about that, because the alternative is nothing. The alternative is Mozilla is probably going to die. Well, not really die, but like there's a possibility that we're going to see a lot of different changes from them that sort of go back on their mission in certain places. At least opt-in. At least the good part is that it's still very opt-in across the board, but we're seeing a shift, is what I'm trying to say. We're seeing a shift towards people and corporations recognizing that you can't play by this idea of the common good anymore. You have to play by the reality that you have to make money in some way. And again, if those terms were more clearer, I don't think we'd have any of this discussion of like what any of this means and like what any of these things are, right? It's I always get fascinated by lawyer stuff, because having had to deal with them just a handful of times, I really got the sense that some lawyers hated other lawyers, and some lawyers were really good, and some lawyers were like really vague, but that all legalese is incomprehensible because of the way that it gets interpreted by the time it gets to the court of law, and the way that it ultimately gets sort of understood by people. Like, I'm pretty sure it still happens now today, and I'm pretty sure both the TikTok hearing and the Loft hearing was a great way of seeing it. Of like, if they don't even know what they're talking about, in the sense of like, let's say people within these courts of law, and then maybe even in like places like Congress within America and like stuff, don't understand these things, and they pass laws, right? So, you translate Congress to whatever your local regional thing is, right? Then how can they even define something that makes sense for it? Like, there is a world where somebody in some place in some country says, well, browsers are not tools, they're all services. And all of a sudden, they're legally liable for everything. And they just throw lawsuits at Google every single day. Like, there's a world where that happens. And so it's why it has to be so clear. But when it's not as clear, you get into these situations where it's like, I don't know what to do. So yeah. It's why I always like to go over those license stuff too, because it's fascinating to see people's different interpretations. You have the side of people who like have assumptions, and you build up from those assumptions, and then using certain words that in other contexts means something else. And it's like, is that the colloquial context or is that the legal context of like understanding it? Like, it's fascinating to think about the implications of the words that we use when people try to understand things. It also sucks because it really goes to show how imprecise language is in many different ways in describing what it is that you want to get across. And how difficult it is to be a lawyer because of how precise you have to be with your language. I've always been fascinated by that world because I'm more interested in the flowery side of things, of like, I like the idea of literature as like a flowery thing of like, you write it and it sounds good to your ears. And it still means roughly what you think it means, and it's easy to interpret it that way. Whereas in law, it's like, it usually doesn't sound good, and it's gotta be very precise, because the moment that you interpret it as anything else, that's legally binding, baby. It's like, shit, what do we do? So, anyways, go read your local laws, find some loopholes like that. Okay, this is actually a very eye-opening experience. Is when you go and you read some legal documents, and you just try to figure out how often you can like break out of that shell. It's surprising how much you can sort of push things, and also how little and how much you have to read in order to understand that you can't push things. Like, there's a lot of legal documents that you have to read for even something as basic as like, can you walk on your sidewalk? Like, that alone is like a very complex matter of like how many things you have to read to know if you can walk on your sidewalk. Like, how many different terms and conditions apply to your walking on the sidewalk, and what different scenarios rise up. But it's also, fun to do because you may actually stumble upon a lawsuit that's worth $250,000. Who really knows, right? Anyways, while you're reading that, I'll be right back in just a moment. I have to bring something in. But it's a good time for a song, actually. Thank you all for joining me for that legal talk. I have a song for you that's actually from an album that it's interesting to sort of think about this album. So this song is from Cowboy Bebop, but not the show. The song actually was never used in the show, but it's a weird sounding song that I think actually could have fit within the show very, very well. It's a song that only showed up on the soundtrack. The soundtrack being, I think it was Vitamin. It's Vitaminless. Yeah, the soundtrack is called Vitaminless. I don't know why they named it that, but it's funny to think about that. If you're vitaminless, okay, you have measles. That's it. It's a song that didn't show up in the show at all. That was on the soundtrack itself. And I actually have a bunch of copies of the soundtrack because my brother bought all of them. And then we lost the actual original thing. So the original discs are gone. But I have my totally legal copy because theoretically, you're allowed to copy things for your own personal use as long as you destroy the original media. So as far as I know, our original CDs of the soundtracks have been destroyed, so at least here in Canada, I can't be sued for this, right? Don't don't give me those eyes. Don't give me those eyes, okay? I'm just saying this for my FBI agent. Look, I'm just saying there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. But thankfully, the version that I'm giving you is on YouTube, so I don't have to be legally liable. But when I was listening to it again, I found this song and I thought it's got a weird vibe to it. I really like the vocals of it. I really like the way that it flows. But it's one of those songs that I didn't think would work because it mixes like drum and bass with very, very melodic singing that feels very, almost very like choral, if that makes sense. And it's interesting because this song doesn't show up in the show, and I feel like it should have showed up in the show at some point because it would have fit. It actually would have fit in quite a few of the fighting scenes, and there was quite a few times, and many times within the show, Cowboy Bebop, where it feels very French in its sort of inspirations and its looks and its like fashion styles. And I say this ahead of time because you're going to hear French. So again, just warning, French. You can't hide from your legal liability, chat. You can't just say in case of investigation by a federal entity or similar that you do not have any involvement with this group or the people in it, and that you do not know how you were here, and that you were probably added by a third party, and that you do not support the actions of my doing. You are just as legally responsible for the gun I'm gonna throw you. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, that was a cool song. Again, I'm surprised that song wasn't used on the show because it has similar trappings to a lot of their other songs, where it's like, I think it's called the blues or something. What songs am I thinking of? It's like the ending song that they usually always play, the real folk blues, and in general, a lot of their songs, like Hamdouche and stuff, the way that it sounds and the way that it has this idea of like lyrics on top of that feel very melodical, on top of like a very, very active backdrop of music. It fits very well within the show. That I'm surprised it wasn't ever played, but as far as I could find out by searching online, it was never played within the show. But I also like that song a lot because there's bits of it, right? The French singing sounds really nice. I will say French sounds really good in a song. I really, really enjoy hearing French singing in specifically. Was it what's her name? Was it Celine Dion? Yeah, Celine Dion's performance at the Olympics, for instance, was fantastic. Right, of that song. What's the song? It's by the same artist who made the Non Je ne regrette rien. Edith Piaf. I forget what the song's name was, but that love song, really, really solid stuff. Im à l'amour is that it? I think it is Im à l'amour. Anyways, but I always find that French singing has a certain flow to it that I really, really enjoy. It has all the complexities of like multi-syllabic languages, but also the way that you speak it and the way that you sort of modulate things almost has a tonal bend to it. But it's not a tonal language fully, I don't think at all even, such that you can actually play with the tones as much as you want. But because of that, because of the way that it, like words can bend because of the accents, and because of the way that sounds sort of like play out in the language, when you add musical singing to it, it feels like an experience because you don't really know how a word is going to be played out, right? There's another singer who I really enjoy who sings French song. Well, he's literally French. Ben Uncle Soul, sorry, Soul Uncle Ben, and his one song "Partir." My French pronunciation is like bad at the moment. This song is also really good if you want to hear like a really good example of like French singing that plays with that system of sound, which is very, very nice. And there's another part of the song that I really enjoyed as well, the backdrop. So this is something that you see throughout the entire Cowboy Bebop album, which is they do a interesting mix of different sound sources. It's not just instruments, right? The Seatbelts are a very, very good band when they play their instruments, but they also use a lot of vocal sounds as well, and a lot of weird synthesized sounds too, like the meme song here, like this specific meme song. This one. Yeah, it's a good meme song. But you hear how that meme song has different sources of it, right? Like, sorry, different instruments being played. You have the synthesized sound itself, like throughout the entire song, that like the weird warbly bits, and then you have the vocal sound bites, which are mixed in as part of the actual beat as well. Do I have a link to the meme song? Yes, I do, and I'll read your other message soon. Because that's also interesting. But the French song that I played, the Fantasy Sign, also does that same thing. If you listen very carefully to the Fantasy Sign song, in the back of it, they actually do what's that noise? They have this like sound of like what's that noise? I don't want to say like a tick, but it's like it sounds like a really cute person going Mo. It's very cute. It's very, very cute and very, very like very adorable in the way that it sounds. In a way, it sounds like their coffee song. What was it? Coffee bar, coffee shop. What's it called again? Black Coffee? Yeah. It sounds like that song Black Coffee, where the song has this like spoken word aspect to it too. And then there's like a woman saying, no, no. Like that. It's surprising how good the song works. And again, I just don't know why they don't have it in the show, but I like every aspect of it. I wouldn't have thought drum and bass would have worked so well with the way that the singing was too. Sorry, I'm so gassy. But the way that it's done does remind me a lot of like say an Avicii song where you have like the electronic beat and then you have someone singing in the front of it. It just with the softness of it, I thought it'd be too jarring. But the drum and bass actually doesn't overpower it. In a way, it complements it and gives it this almost pleasing discordance, if that makes sense. Like it feels like they're moving at two different paces, but at the same time, it's like they're dancing. Someone's slow dancing, other one's going like crazy, like shaking their head. But it feels like they're both dancing to the same song, and that's what that's what I like about the song. It works very very well. And here, this is an example of the Black Coffee song. Here, look, just like listen. Okay, sorry, I was choking on the chip because every time I go BRB like that, I do chip. Nice take indeed, right? That song again. If they can play that song in the show, I'm surprised they didn't play Fantasy Sign because that song has all the same trappings, but it's also in a way its own episodic song. Like it's its own storytelling. It's its own story. Even the way that the instruments respond to the dialogue, it's so funny because it's like, you know what this is? This is a soundtrack for all of you losers out there who can't get a date. No, I'm just kidding. But it tells a story. The instruments tell a story. It's still an entertaining song in its own right, but combined with everything else and the way that it overlays everything and with the cuteness of the voice and stuff, it's funny the way that it plays out. But again, if they have that song, why can't Fantasy Sign be in it too? So yeah. Anyways, it's all from. If you've never heard the soundtrack of Cowboy Bebop, it's great. You should give it a full listen. It's pretty nice to hear the entire thing. And especially, I really like how the soundtrack and the album incorporates like a ton of different languages. Like, I think there's at least like 4 different languages: English, Japanese, French, and whatever they speak in Morocco. Because one of the songs is a Moroccan Nawar song. But it's really good stuff, and I'm just very surprised at how flexible the whole album is, and how pleasing it sounds. Now to your message. Your assumption was based on the fact that the binaries weren't distributed under an open license. Linux people would be going nuts about it. Similarly, they had to go nuts about Google Chrome binaries being under a proprietary license. That is true, and I didn't think about that. And I didn't think about the fact that Linux people are hard about making sure it's free software, so you're correct. And it's good that you double-checked the site itself and that you found specifically the link where it's like, that they're distributed under MPL. Because going over the MPL, and thankfully the MPL is like the Mozilla public license. This is, again, the Mozilla public license is the thing that I look at and I go, this is a good license. Like, everything that they've had so far before in terms of legal stuff, very well written, very clear and concise, right? And that license is no different. If it is under MPL, then yeah, it would make sense that you can distribute their binary under anything. And so whatever it is in terms of like them stopping you is it's only going to stop you in terms of you download it from their official sources. So like specifically probably only from their sites. But then it's weird that they have that sort of like distinction of you can't have it from their authorized sources compared to other places, right? And then like the terms really only apply under that one thing, but at the same time it makes sense because like they're authorized sources from their servers, and they themselves as a corporate as like whatever they're called don't want to be liable for any part of that of the supply chain of something. But then I think that's sort of also key to the point of like that's why I hesitate for the word leak, because it's not really leaking at that point. You're just distributing something that you have full license to do so, right? Like that's why the legal stuff is like weird to me, because like if we say leak, it's not the same as necessarily distributing it under the same license as it was. To leak something implies that it should have been sealed up in the first place. It's like the way that you interpret that word. I can't interpret the word leak in any other way. I don't think that would imply that it's meant to be open. Like if you turn on your faucet, right? and the water flows out, I don't think it's leaking. Although it would be funny to think like that. Like imagine you go to brush your teeth every morning and you turn on your like sink, and then you say, "Oh God, it's leaking." Like it would be funny to react in that sense. But I think it's fair to say more specifically, it's being redistributed, like under your license agreement, which like still works. And not to say that it's under the same license when you redistribute it, because like even the MPL, for instance, and like many other licenses that I know of, they allow you to redistribute under other licenses. But just the fact that the license grants you that right to do so. Yeah, you just called it leak. Well, guess what, buddy? The lawyer that's watching over this to catch me in the act of committing the crime has taken your version of the leak and said that you're committing a crime. I hate lawyers. I don't want to deal with lawyers. You know what? Do you know what I want to deal with? Cheating. Let's move on to the game today, okay? But that was a good talk. Again, it's always fun to talk about this stuff because I'm always interested to see how people interpret things, and it always makes me painfully aware that I wish I had a better legal background, but I don't want to go through the bar exam because I look at the bar exam and look at how much you have to do, and I go, oh God, I can barely wrap my head around some of the larger rest things, especially when you go with like FFI. Like I can't really do much of that, and then I think like if I can't do that, how am I ever gonna understand the license under which my coffee mug is licensed under? But yeah, excuse me, sorry, I need like a quick moment here. I need to go get some very quick water because I ran out. I feel my throat closing in my throat. So just give me a second, and we'll be right back in just a moment. But hopefully this music will keep you happy for the meantime, because I do enjoy this whole playlist. Well, the entire album. I really enjoy the entire sort of like whatchamacallit, the Cowboy Bebop album. And you know what? We might as well just play their most iconic song from the show that I think everyone knows of, just because it's there, and it's specifically 6 minutes, which gives me just enough time to go get what I need, and I'll come back in just a moment. Okay? BRB. Okay, we don't need to listen to the full fade out. The fade out is like 30 seconds long. Like the fade out of these songs and a lot of like say like the Smile songs with Tom York. It feels like somebody who just really wants to do a really cool fade out, but they don't understand that if it takes too long, it gets a little awkward, right? Because at some point it gets so infinitesimally quiet, you can't hear anything. And you're not fading out into the distance anymore. You're just waiting for it to end so you can move on. Like, I imagine somebody in the recording studio when they're mastering the thing, they're turning the fade knob and they're going like ever so slightly to the left as it keeps on going on and on and on. Or they program it so it goes down by 0.01% of total decibels or something. Like it's so slow. But yeah, you use the word leak in the Red Hat situation because the word felt appropriate. They can't prohibit you from distributing their commercial distros since they're on the GPO, but they also don't have to provide you with the commercial distros if they learn that you redistribute them. See, that I would have probably said it's them. Like that to me doesn't really imply leak. Like to me, leak. And again, this is the problem with like words like this, especially with the way that you would interpret them, right? It's why very often when you go through like a legal document, they'll have a section that's like what do all these terms mean, and henceforth we will refer to these parties or these terms as this, but these terms specifically mean this. We just use this like one word to mean it, but in the context of this document, it means this. Because when you say leak, I think to myself, it shouldn't have been released at all, no matter the context. Like that to me seems more like a business decision than a legal one. Where it's like in the legal sense, they don't have to provide it because it's just a service that they provide as their business, but they can't stop someone from redistributing it. But it's not really a legal thing for them to have to provide you something because that's up to their business. If it loses them money to distribute something, like let's say in the far future Mozilla has like $1 left, okay, and to run the server costs like $10. We can't reasonably expect them to keep the server up, right? But it's like, but that reason extends to everything. Like if they happen to want to try to run their business like that, and only provide like the open source sort of side of things to people who redistribute it in order to try and sort of like give themselves a market advantage. There's nothing really wrong with that. But I don't really think of that as a leak. I always think of that more as a business decision and a way for them to try and capture more of whatever it is that makes their sauce work, right? A leak, an intentional disclosure of something secret or private. Yeah, in which case it's not really secret or private, right? It's not really secret or private. Like it feels like it's something that is meant to be out in the open. They just don't do it to certain people if they redistribute them because of some decision on like a business level. But it's not a secret or a private thing. It's out there in the open as it is. So that to me is more about the act of withholding than necessarily the act of it letting loose. Like it's like I look at it from the perspective of them holding back versus distributing it. Versus I look at it from the act of them holding back something that is public. So intentionally obscuring it versus necessarily leaking something that is private. Because if it was a leak, by that definition, we would never have access to it. Unless you buy it specifically. And if you buy it specifically, presumably you're under different terms, right? Or maybe it's the same term. I don't know. But then, then it gets into the whole idea of like, well, is that a shitty move or is that a fine move? Like if it's allowed by the license, is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? It's like that whole thing of, if they didn't want people to redistribute like the source of something, maybe they should have thought about that in terms of the license, where it's like you can't just rely on people's goodwill. Also, I want to give you an update on my breakfast because I thought it was funny. I eat like somebody who goes to the gym as like a religious experience, like eight hours a day, but I don't leave my chair for the next like 16 hours. I had 2 scoops of peanut butter straight into my mouth, and I had 1 drizzle of honey, again, straight into my mouth from the bottle. Why is it the bottle? I don't know. I couldn't get the can version, so I just got the bottle version. I squeezed it, and it tasted just fine. Yeah, whether or not Links people are happy with it or not is a totally different story. Surely there's a joke somewhere about like the happiness, like the bus meme where it's like the person staring at the wall and the person staying out into the sun, into the greener pastures. It's like the bus side is the Linux users, and then the happy side is also the Linux users. They're both the same people. They just decide whether or not they want to sit on this side today or on that side. Surely there's a meme there. Somebody's going to do it, and it's going to be a lot better than what I described. But I've given you the sauce. You just need to cook. All you need to do is a cook. Sorry today is such a short stream. I thought we were going to actually play later, my friends and I at 5, but actually my buddy booted up and said it's fine. So we have to go now. He's done work in like 20 minutes, so we're probably going to start soon, I think, or like half an hour, I'm not really sure. And we're going to go right into Monster Hunter Wilds. I think he's playing now, actually, to be fair. So, sorry about that. I was going to do some more Fly Night and stuff. We'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow's actually a special day. Tomorrow's a full stream day, where we'll be doing some headliners with Athol, Noggy, and Herb. So if you want to check out that, it's going to be fun. I imagine being in New York is going to be very fun. I've seen very limited amounts of gameplay, so it's still fresh to me. And I kind of can't wait to try that game out. Afterwards, we'll do some, I don't know, anything that I have in mind. Sunday is going to be the weird day for things, so if you want to see some cool stuff, come Sunday. It won't have Sven co-op yet. I'm still looking into solutions as to how to make Sven co-op work in a way that none of us get doxxed. My bad. But when I do figure it out, I'll let you know. I just don't really know how yet. Beyond that, yeah, I don't really know what else to do. But next week, actually, we do have some more fun things that we get to try out, because some things I've been saving for a while. And I think it's time to get some more dopamine injections. Like, sometimes it's nice to have dopamine back into the system. So, tomorrow, headliners, probably Fly Night. Sunday, some really weird things that I found that I think you'll all enjoy. And the next week onwards, just some new things that I found, just some random one-offs here and there. And we'll actually be going back to sandbox programming too, because I feel fine to go back to programming. But Monday, Tuesday, I'm probably going to be busy with my wife, so who knows. Bye, everyone. Please have a good day. I wonder if I can rate anyone, because it's nice to end early. And I will say this. It feels good not to stream, actually. I don't know how to say this, but in a way, I do enjoy not really streaming sometimes. It's kind of nice to just hang out and be my own person and do my own things. Like, it feels more fulfilling in its own way. Sadly, no one's on, so I think we we just go. Bye, everyone. Have a good night. Enjoy your day. If you're playing Monster Hunter Wilds, please let me know inside the channel.